Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to FAIR's free monthly webinar series. My name is Lynn Hewen. I'm FAIR's Senior Manager for Family Services, and I'll be your moderator for today's presentation. I'll be taking your questions throughout the broadcast using both the questions and chat features in the toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. Please note that this is the only way to interact with us today, as all attendees will be muted. As time permits, we will give our presenters an opportunity to respond to questions at the end of the presentation. This presentation, as are all of FAIR's webinars, will be recorded and posted on the FAIR website in about 7 to 10 days. Before we start today's webinar, we wanted to take a moment to recognize today as Global FPIES Day. Food protein-induced enterocolitis syndrome is a type of food allergy affecting the gastrointestinal tract. You can learn more from our friends at the FPIES Foundation at fpiesday.org. At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenters. Our key speaker today is Dr. Robert Wood. Dr. Wood is a professor of pediatrics and chief of pediatric allergy and immunology at Johns Hopkins and professor of international health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Wood is an internationally recognized expert in food allergy and childhood asthma and has published more than 100 manuscripts in scientific journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, Pediatrics, and the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology, as well as 2 books and numerous book chapters. He is the deputy editor of the Journal of Pediatric Allergy and Immunology and was previously an associate editor of the Annals of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. Dr. Wood has served on the editorial board of the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology and is on the board of directors at the American Board of Allergy and Immunology. Sharing some additional insights on FAIR's efforts from an advocacy and policy standpoint will be Scott Riccio, FAIR Senior Vice President of Education and Advocacy at FAIR. Here, Scott is responsible for the overall strategic leadership of the education and advocacy departments. He has an increasingly strategic leadership roles at various companies, including Dendreon, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and most recently, Synergiva Biopharma. He holds an MBA in Entrepreneurship and Strategy from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and as father to a daughter with a peanut and tree nut allergy, his professional experience is further enhanced by his personal connection to FAIR's mission. At this time, I am delighted to turn the presentation over to Dr. Wood.
Thank you, Lynn, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to you today. We will try to make this informative, obviously, but also very practical because there are a lot of practical issues with dealing with sesame allergy that come up on a regular basis, and I'm going to spend most of my time really trying to address those and then leaving time for your questions at the end. If I could have the next slide, Lynn. So just as a bit of background, we sort of recognize sesame as becoming increasingly popular in the Western diet. It's been a common food ingredient in certain cuisines for centuries, but we've seen it enter the Western diet much more commonly, including those ethnic foods, but something you'll now find on the shelf of any grocery store you walk into. We see lots of sesame allergy, and whether that's because the allergy is truly more common or there's just a lot more exposure are questions that are still being worked out. But we do recognize that sesame seeds can be a very potent allergen, can lead to severe allergic reactions. I'll talk in the next few minutes about a very wide range of sesame reactions. So not everyone with sesame allergy is at risk for severe reactions with every exposure, and that's one of sort of the tricky practical issues about dealing with this type of allergy. It's used across the food industry, but certainly we all know about seeds that show up on breads and bagels and crackers, but also as pastes and oils. They're very versatile, so they get put in a variety of different foods. And then in non-sesame products, there may be exposure both as an ingredient, but also due to cross-contact, sometimes referred to as cross-contamination, with sesame-containing products in that same factory or bakery. Next slide. So we don't know the exact prevalence of sesame allergy, and we'll come back around to this as an important issue in terms of why sesame should or should not be included in the labeling laws under the FDA's jurisdiction. There's a strong sense that the prevalence of sesame allergy has been increasing. There's a little bit of information to support that, but overall the scientific evidence about increasing prevalence is lacking. and that doesn't always mean it's not there. It may just mean that the right studies haven't been done. And that's been the same sort of issue with lots of food allergy prevalence studies, where it's just hard to pin down the numbers because these studies are not easy to do. There may be some significant regional differences. And when I'm speaking about region, that certainly may be the case across North America. But internationally, there's been suggestion that sesame allergy is more common in some areas of the world than others, very likely related to the use of sesame in diets that may be greater in some cuisines than others. Next slide. So I'm going to show you a few of the studies that have been done looking at the prevalence of sesame allergy. And these are not to say that these numbers are absolutely accurate, but these are very well done studies. The first one being shown here is one that FAIR supported in its previous iteration as FAN. And this has been a very important series of studies because it has been this series of studies using a telephone survey that has clearly shown the rising prevalence of peanut and tree nut allergy over a 10 to 15-year period. In this most recent survey, sesame was included, and they found a prevalence rate of 0.1% of all of the surveyed people, which is meant to represent the overall population. So as opposed to, say, any nut allergy there, which would be expected to show up in 1.5% or so of all people, sesame is going to be closer to 1 in 1,000 people. And I think the relative proportions here are probably hard to argue with, saying that sesame allergy is common, but it's probably tenfold less common than overall nut allergy. Next slide. This is a similar study done across Canada, and it's always reassuring when the numbers on these different studies come out somewhat similarly, because as I said, it's very hard to do these food allergy prevalence studies and to come up with accurate numbers. And what they found here was a prevalence for peanut and tree nut allergy of about 1% of the population. Shellfish came out to be most common at 1.6%. And as in the United States study run by Scott Sisher, the sesame prevalence came out at 0.1%. And again, I think the exact prevalence isn't known, but the relative proportion is probably quite accurate. So probably 10 times as many people with a peanut or tree nut allergy as there are those with sesame allergy. Next slide. It's been said that sesame is more common, as I said, in certain parts of the world, and Israel is an example. And Israel has been an interesting country to look at food allergy. That's some of where the early information came out, saying that peanut allergy is less common there, and that may be related to early exposure to peanut. And because sesame is a very common part of the diet, and actually may not be introduced quite as early as peanut, they found a higher rate of sesame allergy than they have peanut allergy. So sesame allergy is the third most common food allergy in Israel based on a couple of different studies. As in most countries, milk and egg are most common. In the United States, peanut would be right after milk and egg. But in Israel, sesame was the third most common food allergy. But recognize that even though it was third most common, the prevalence was still on the low end of the spectrum of 0.1 to 0.2% of the population. Next slide. Now this slide is a little bit complicated, but I'll focus on a couple of key points here. And there has been a very, very interesting, useful study going on in Australia for the last 5 years. And this is a study that is truly designed to test the rate of food allergy in a broad population. And these studies are very hard to do because to really do it, you have to do food challenges on everyone. And as everyone on the phone recognizes, there's a lot of inaccuracy in diagnosing food allergies. Somebody might test positive to a food, but eat that food without any difficulty. But in this study, referred to as a HealthNut study, they screened about 3,000 babies who were coming into just well baby clinics to get their immunizations. And they had skin testing done and blood testing done to peanut, egg, sesame, and shellfish. And they found very high rates of allergy to these foods, higher than has been seen in other studies around the world. But it's really impossible to argue with the numbers because they actually did food challenges to prove whether or not somebody who had a positive skin test or positive blood test truly had allergy to that food. And in the column that's circled on this slide here, they found that 2.9% of the babies coming into these well child clinics had peanut allergy, that 9% had allergy to egg. The only caveat there is the test they did was to raw egg, which is clearly more potent than scrambled egg and far more potent than baked egg, but a very, very high rate of egg allergy. And sesame allergy here came out at 0.7%. And remember, in the US, Canada, and Israeli studies, we were talking about 0.1 or 0.2%. So even looking at a food challenge, they found a much higher rate of sesame allergy than has ever been shown before. One of the interesting things you'll see looking at the details in this slide is that when you take somebody who has a moderate to large skin test, here defined as greater or equal than 3 millimeters, about half of those who tested positive by skin test turned out to be truly allergic when they were challenged. So 1.6% of the babies had a positive skin test to sesame, 0.7% had true sesame allergy. And the proportion was pretty similar for peanut. 6.4% had a positive skin test, and about half of them turned out to have true peanut allergy when they did a peanut challenge. So these are studies that we could use a lot more of, but they're not easy to do, and particularly because they require food challenges which carry both risk and lots of labor to get them accomplished. Next slide. So another really key question that comes up, and this is actually one of the most common questions, is how often is sesame allergy associated with other food allergies? And this often comes up because you may be with a child. I may be in my clinic, you may be in your clinic, you may be in your household, with a child who's presented with another food allergy. And it is very common for patients with sesame allergy to actually be identified because they presented initially with a different food allergy. And it appears from our clinical experience that sesame allergy is more common to show up in children that have peanut or tree nut or both peanut and tree nut allergies. They seem to travel sort of in the same circles with one another. So if we have a child, for example, show up, with an 8-month-old with a milk allergy, we wouldn't automatically be that suspicious that they're also hiding a sesame allergy. But if we see a child show up with peanut or tree nut allergy, we're automatically a little bit more worried that we should test them for sesame because that may be an allergy that they're holding but have not yet exhibited just because sesame has not been introduced into the diet yet. So clearly some people show up with a first reaction to sesame, have never had a reaction to anything else, but this was a study looking at relationships between peanut, tree nut, and sesame allergy. And what was shown there is that if you took children with peanut allergy, 13.2% had sesame allergy. If you took children who had tree nut allergy, it was 14.8%. And if you took the fairly common situation, lots of you are sitting with kids with this combination of peanut and tree nut allergy at home right now, 50% had a sesame allergy. And again, this is a select population. It was done in a referral clinic at Boston Children's Hospital, but it does indicate that there is a higher chance of having a sesame allergy if you've already exhibited other food allergy, particularly to peanut or tree nut, and especially to both of those foods. Next slide. Now, another very common question, and it's one we talk about every day in clinic, is what is the relationship of sesame allergy to other seed allergies? And the overall information, and again, we're a little bit limited on hard scientific facts, but the overall information is that it's very clear that most patients with sesame allergy do not have other seed allergies. When they do have other seed allergies, in our clinical experience, sunflower allergy appears to be the most common other seed to be allergic to. But the other seed allergy is not common enough so that when I see a patient with sesame allergy, I automatically do testing or automatically recommend avoidance. And with all these things, I'm making very general statements that you need to talk to your own doctor or allergist about. But I see lots of patients, and I see patients on a weekly basis, if not several times a week, who have a very clear-cut sesame allergy and have been instructed that they automatically need to avoid all other seeds. And we would say that that advice is not appropriate. Whether you need to test other seeds before you introduce them is another question, but we do not automatically either test or avoid other seeds in patients with sesame allergy. Next slide. We're always questioned about the natural history of any food allergy, and we've done lots of studies over time to look, say, at how many kids outgrow milk allergy and by what age, and how many kids outgrow peanut allergy. And there have been 2 studies done on the natural history of sesame allergy. And overall, it appears that the rate of outgrowing sesame allergy is in the range that we see with peanut allergy, that about 20%, maybe as high as 30% of children with sesame allergy will outgrow their allergy. So our recommendation about this is that even though it's an allergy that's hard to outgrow, there's enough people who do outgrow it that we would want to monitor test results over time, consider food challenges when appropriate, and we usually monitor until the pattern has been established. And what I mean by that, it's the same thing we do with somebody who's got a peanut allergy, a tree nut allergy. If they're clearly allergic based on prior reactions and they test strongly positive and their test results don't change over time, that is, they've given us no real hope they're outgrowing that allergy, we stop testing regularly. We may go from annual testing to every 2 or 3 years, and at some point it becomes pretty clear that that's an allergy that's going to stay and does not need to be followed up upon. But normally, at least through the first 5 or 6 years, if not 8 or 10 years of life, we would do retesting on an annual or every other year basis to see if there's a sign that the allergy's been outgrown. And we'll talk a little bit more about what testing we would use in the next section here. Next slide. So the diagnosis of sesame allergy is the same as any other food allergy. And there are some nuances that I think are very important, but the overall approach is these 4 procedures: history, skin test, blood test, and food challenge. Now, the first bullet here, history of reaction, is always the most important means of diagnosis. Because if someone has had a clear-cut reaction versus someone who has never had a reaction and has only a positive test. So this is the child, for example, who has shown up in my clinic with a peanut allergy, and they've never had a reaction to sesame. That may be because they've never eaten it. It may be that they've actually eaten it, but not in great quantities, so we're not positive, but never had a reaction. So the whole paradigm is quite different in somebody that's had a reaction versus somebody who's not had a reaction but may have a positive test. We use skin tests and blood tests to try to sort out the chance that someone's allergic. And as a general rule, as with other foods, the higher the test, the stronger the skin test, the higher the blood test, the more likely it is that someone has a true sesame allergy. But these tests are far from perfect, and there are people who have rather strongly positive tests who turn out to be perfectly fine eating that food. And then some of the nuances are that they may be fine eating sesame in some forms but not others, and I'll get into that in a bit of detail in a moment. Next slide, please. So this is another complicated slide, but I'll point out the key piece of information here. And this is looking at measuring IgE levels, the blood test for food allergy, and it's comparing here different cutoff points to diagnose peanut, tree nut, and sesame seed allergy. And the key number I'd have you focus on is over on about the 5th column that says median. And what that means is that of those people that had a true sesame allergy, the median IgE result was 7.74. So we would say, sort of as a general estimate then, the higher you go above 7.74, the more likely you are to have a true sesame allergy. The lower you are below that, the more likely it is to be a positive test that does not indicate a true allergy. And this is the sort of approach we would take in clinic. So if I saw a patient who had a clear-cut peanut allergy, and we tested for sesame and their level came out at, say, 50 to 100, we would be almost certain that they're allergic, and we would typically not do a food challenge. If they had a level that came out in the lower range, say below 10, we'd be very hopeful that they're not truly allergic, and we would do a food challenge. And then every patient is managed kind of individually, deciding whether it's important at that point in time to really know about the diagnosis. But sesame is a food that's common enough and difficult enough to avoid that we feel that at some point, if we're not sure about the diagnosis, it's very important that we clarify it by doing a food challenge. Next slide. Now this is just a little bit of a side thing from that same study, and this is looking at the types of reactions that were reported in these patients with peanut, tree nut, and seed allergy. This was not in food challenges. This is in people that had had reactions, what they reported. And what you'll see here is that the overall pattern is similar, with skin in the purple, respiratory in the maroon, GI in the yellow being the most common signs of reaction for each of these foods, with sesame being in the far right-hand end of the graph. But that all of them are somewhat less common with sesame allergy. And they don't make it really clear in the paper what their symptoms were if they didn't include these things, but my suspicion is that there were patients in here who had rather localized reactions where they just had itching in their mouth or throat and didn't even see anything more outwardly. And thankfully, not that we don't see patients with very severe anaphylaxis to sesame, but they had a very low percentage, about 1%, who reported a generalized or anaphylactic reaction to sesame seed. Next slide. So I do want to talk for a moment here about food challenges with sesame, because we actually approach these in my clinic a little bit differently than we do for many other foods. And we approach them differently because the way people react to sesame can be highly variable from one person to another, and highly variable depending on the type of sesame that the patient is being exposed to. And I'll give you a few examples. I will commonly see patients who've had a clear-cut reaction to hummus, but have previously eaten sesame seeds with no difficulty. We'll commonly see patients that have had severe reactions to a tahini paste or a kind of ground form of sesame, but they've never experienced a reaction, at least when they got small numbers of sesame seeds. So we actually consider challenges in several categories. And one category that may be very important to the day-to-day life of that family is what is the risk of that child with a few sesame seeds. And I would say the majority of my patients with sesame allergy don't have a risk with a few sesame seeds. That they have a high risk with other forms, but that a few intact seeds are not necessarily going to cause a reaction. We have to be very careful because it turns out that more so than most other foods, if not all other foods, when you have a reaction to intact sesame seeds, it may be more delayed. It seems that it takes a while for those seeds to be broken down in your intestinal tract and release the allergen to cause a reaction. So when we've done challenges in the past using intact sesame seeds, we've had some patients who've eaten lots and lots of seeds initially and have been perfectly fine for 3 or 4 hours and then had a significant reaction. So normally if someone is fine with intact sesame seeds, we do want to push a little bit further, although there are some patients who've clearly had a reaction in the recent past to hummus or tahini paste, where there's no real value in pushing them to have another reaction, and where we may only challenge them to a small challenge of sesame seeds, really just to confirm that their day-to-day risk from, say, a bread that has a seed on it, or a bread that has been produced on the same equipment with sesame, really may not pose much of a risk to them. We often pulverize our seeds, and what we find is that there are patients who will not react to intact seeds, but will react to pulverized seeds. So to do a real sesame challenge, to really prove someone is not allergic to sesame in any form, it needs to be done with either pulverized seeds or tahini paste, both of which are much more potent and much more likely to cause reactions. So it really depends on the goal of the challenge. Sometimes the goal is really just to say what's the day-to-day risk with a little bit of sesame. In other instances, it's to prove once and for all that that child or that adult does not have any form of sesame allergy, in which case we would need to use a pulverized seed or tahini paste. Next slide. So the treatment of sesame allergy is the same as all other food allergies. It's avoidance and treating reactions. We'll talk more about avoidance, but we always need to be prepared to treat reactions with self-injectable epinephrine on hand. And there are very few patients with sesame allergy where we would not recommend having epinephrine available. So it's just not that predictable an allergy to say that someone would not be at risk for anaphylaxis. We're interested in all foods about the possibility of doing immunotherapy, but right now we have very little information on sesame immunotherapy. There are no studies where it's been used as a single allergen. There are some studies where it's being used as a multi-allergen oral immunotherapy. Say a patient who is allergic to peanut, tree nuts, sesame may be getting a combination of all of those in their immunotherapy. But there's no data yet on specific outcomes for sesame in even those studies. So this is an area in need of study and something that we'll certainly know a lot more about over the next 5 to 10 years. Next slide. So avoidance is tricky with sesame, and it's tricky because sesame is not covered by the labeling law, and you'll hear more about those details and where that stands in terms of potential changes in a moment. But it could be included then in foods where it's not clearly labeled. So it could show up in a food as a spice or natural flavoring. Does it? Very, very, very rarely. But it is something that we would like to not have to worry about. It can also show up in an ambiguous term. It could show up in an ambiguous term like not everyone knows that sesame could be labeled as tahini, and tahini is probably the most important form of sesame. So what the labeling law would require is, if sesame got included, was that it could not be in a food without clear labeling, so that if it said tahini, they would have to say that is sesame, just like they would have to say that casein means milk. And it could not be hidden within a overall ingredient like a natural flavoring without being accurately labeled. We worry about cross-contact with sesame. Although I said a lot of patients don't react to those small amounts, it is very, very common for things, especially breads and bagels, to have some contact with sesame in the processing. Sesame oil is commonly used, and it is an unrefined oil. And when you think about all of the oils from allergenic foods that are out there, we know that a lot of them are highly refined oils where the protein has been largely or completely removed. So if someone has, say, a soy allergy, they can usually have soy oil without a problem. And even most peanut oil is safe for people with peanut allergy. But sesame oil, to maintain its flavor, is an unrefined oil, so it contains the sesame protein. It's especially popular in Asian foods, but it can show up in lots of different places, especially salad dressings, marinades, and barbecue sauces. There's a few foreign terms that may indicate sesame. I've listed there: Bene, Gingelli, Teal, or Simpson. There's an herbal drink called Aqua Libra that contains sesame. There may be more that I don't know about. And then, as with other foods, especially tree nuts, you may find sesame oil in skincare products or cosmetics where it may or may not be listed, and it may or may not be listed under a term that we're familiar with. So this word here, sesamin indicum, is a way it may show up on a lotion or cosmetic. Next slide. Hummus, tahini, and halva. These are three very popular sesame products. As I said, they're potent sesame products, and they could show up on a label without using the word sesame under the current labeling laws. So we're worried with those foods showing up, especially Middle Eastern foods. I mentioned sesame oil and Asian foods, and then there are other possible places to be watchful of sesame or bakery products, bagels, confection bars, muesli, dips, sausages, processed meats, veggie burgers, chutneys, stir fries, so lots and lots of places that you may encounter sesame. And again, at the bottom, sesame oil is a common ingredient in Asian foods, almost a universal ingredient in certain Asian cuisines. Next slide. So I just want to finish here with some practical considerations. These are things that we discuss on an individual patient basis, and you should be feeling free to discuss with your allergist on an individual basis. So these are the questions that we talk about most often. So what products really pose a risk for that individual patient? Is that somebody who might react to a seed or two, where cross-contact could be a really significant risk? Is it someone who reacts to seeds, but it takes lots of seeds? So they'd be fine if a seed was stuck on their bagel, but if they ate a sesame bagel, it would be a real problem. Are they people who are actually okay with seeds, but react to oils or tahini? And again, for day-to-day life, these are questions that I think are worth sorting out because doing complete absolute sesame avoidance, worried about all products that may be cross-contaminated with sesame, is a remarkably difficult task, whereas just having to worry about more concentrated forms, it's still an imposition, but it's not nearly as difficult. In the same context, what's the risk of cross-contact? How worried do you need to be? Again, I can only give general recommendations, but for most of my patients, we worry completely about cross-contact for peanut and tree nuts, and far less so from sesame. The residue that comes off a few sesame seeds often does not cause reactions. So we may have different rules for different patients and different rules for different foods. What's the chance it will appear in a food unlabeled? And by that I mean, as I showed on the last slide, as a natural flavoring or a spice or really a clear ingredient in the food, but where you couldn't find that in an ingredient label. The real question underlying that is, if you have a severe sesame allergy, and if a food label says natural flavoring, do you need to avoid that food completely? Do you need to call the company? How often will sesame be in that food? And it's a question I can't answer. We don't have good data on how often that occurs. It's something that, for example, with mustard allergy, we see all the time. If the word spices or natural flavoring shows up and you have a severe mustard allergy, it is quite common for mustard to be one of those spices. Thankfully, a lot less common with sesame, but we just can't say not to worry about it because it could happen until the labeling law includes sesame. And that's sort of one of our, real prime concerns about sesame not being part of the labeling law. And I'll turn it over to Scott in the next slide. But the basic questions that have come up that he'll review in more detail is this allergy common enough to really justify being on a labeling law? It turns out it is in Europe and Canada. Is 0.1% enough to justify that? And the FDA, when they originally made this law, said no. We would argue that it is enough, and that because sesame can cause very severe reactions, the burden of sesame allergy really does justify having that issue resolved. We would argue that even though 0.1% is not real high, it's actually higher than certain individual tree nuts. So all of the tree nuts got included in the labeling law, but sesame allergy, I'm sure, is more common than almond allergy, but almond is included, so that's another argument that we're making. And the hope is that the arguments that have been put forward to the FDA, and now Scott will explain in more detail, will lead to a change with the inclusion of sesame sometime over the next few years. think that's my last slide, Lynn.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Wood. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Scott so he can talk a little bit about things from an advocacy and policy standpoint.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks, Dr. Wood, as well. Obviously, I think Dr. Wood has done a terrific job kind of laying out the data, the challenge, the risks, and the questions, and I think made a great case for why it ought to be labeled. But I think, you know, coming at it as also a parent of a child with food allergies, you know, we spend a lot of time worrying about risk of cross contact, and you know, consider ourselves fortunate, you know, with peanut and tree nut allergies, that we don't have to spend as much time thinking about the chance that it would appear in a food unlabeled because of the labeling laws. And so we're cognizant of how impactful and how much change in lives and quality of life being included in that labeling law has made for us. So just to talk just for a minute by way of background for those who aren't familiar, although I suspect almost all of you on the phone or on the webinar are, in 2004, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, or FALCPA, as you'll occasionally hear us refer to it, was passed. And that was where the list of what are called major food allergens was defined. And so that was the Big 8 list: tree nut, milk, eggs, wheat, soy, fish, and shellfish. And that law then required that a major food allergen, i.e. one of those 8, had to be disclosed on a food label in plain language when that food is or when it also contains one of the listed allergens. So as Dr. Wood mentioned, that's saying, you know, it may say casein on the ingredient list and has to also then say this product contains milk, so that it's very clear to folks in plain language. The Act also gave the FDA, and this is one of the wrinkles that's worth sort of noting as one avenue to get at some of dealing with some of the challenges that Dr. Wood mentioned. It also gave the FDA authority to amend the regulations to require that a specific spice, flavoring, coloring, or incidental additive be declared by name on the label also when that ingredient is a food allergen, but not one of the major food allergens. And so FDA has done this twice, I think, in the past with non-major food allergens, but required them to be labeled and named on the label as well. Next slide. So, you know, as it relates FALCPA and Sesame in particular, by way of updates, there was what's called a citizen petition, which is one way to, for folks in the public sphere, basically, to ask FDA to take action. That petition was submitted to FDA in late November of 2014, requesting that FDA require sesame to be listed by name on an ingredient list and added to the major food allergens list, so thus becoming the big 9, if you will. More recently, late spring of this year, Senator Murphy in Connecticut, with whom we worked, as well as Senator Markey in Massachusetts and Senator Blumenthal in Connecticut as well, submitted a joint letter from the 3 of them to FDA asking for the specific expansion of FALCPA, basically for the FDA to put out guidance to say the Big 8 now should be expanded to include sesame. We also provided a letter of support to the senator and some data as well, and have continued to work with their office in making sure that that they have the data and that FDA has the data and the information and understands that we are supportive as well. FDA is also a sponsor. FAIR has long championed and finally was able to get off the ground an Institute of Medicine study, which is looking basically the burden of food allergies. And it's a significant study from a policy perspective for sure, I think, in elaborating and bringing to light a number of the challenges that folks with food allergies face. FDA also chose to help sponsor that study in part because they were looking for information on the burden of food allergies, including the burden of sesame, and trying to get some data around it. As Dr. Wood mentioned, the data is sparse, so any place that data could be expanded, enhanced, or augmented in some way, FDA was looking for that. Next slide. So as far as FAIR and Sesame goes, we are clearly communicating to our support to FDA for the addition of sesame to the FALCPA labeling requirements. I think on a couple of fronts, it's meaningful and important. I think one is, and as was mentioned by Dr. Wood earlier, there is certainly a fair amount now of global consideration of labels. You know, a number of manufacturers are thinking about global harmonization of their labels. And so these major allergens that are identified in other countries, you know, that lends some additional support that consumers in those countries have benefited from the disclosure of that we feel would make sense. If you're going to harmonize your label, harmonize it to the one that provides more information and not less. I think also the other key part of FALCPA that's maybe not as well understood, in part because the additional guidance is new, FDA has also recently put out, has basically finalized a rule from a law passed now 5 years ago around manufacturing processes. So good manufacturing processes, what FDA looks at and calls preventive controls. And that is for, you know, folks who are manufacturing goods that, you know, again, could be bread, other packaged goods. They now are going to have to begin developing written controls to deal with allergen cross-contact. The reason FALCPA is important here is FALCPA is the written rules are required around cross-contact for major food allergens. And so if sesame is added to the major food allergens list, then manufacturers will also have to consider that in their written controls to prevent cross-contact of sesame. So while, as Dr. Wood said, that may be less of an issue in sesame, we think it's a huge impact for all of those major food allergens, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with FDA to drive that guidance forward and share with the community as the manufacturers begin to implement those new rules. We're also very focused on obviously building public awareness and education and support for sesame. So I'll talk in a second about the pieces that are coming. And I say, you know, education and awareness is incredibly important for us from a policy perspective, because we're also certainly trying to work to inform manufacturers, for instance, of the magnitude of the issue and the magnitude of the risk that patients are dealing with. And so being able to provide some guidance, some insight into both the data on the size of the risk in terms of population, but also, you know, the stories that bring that risk to life. So I've had a number of folks of late, you know, share their stories with me. That's incredibly powerful and impactful. So, you know, if you have stories of the challenges you faced in dealing with those foods, I would ask you to please share them with us. You know, it is important. It does help sort of bring that data to life. And you know, Dr. Wood mentioned a whole number of those challenges, and those are born of real world stories, I'm sure, in his clinic. So on the educational front, we have resources coming, the how to read a label reference sheet and cards specific to sesame, much as we have done with the other major food allergens. Chef cards for individuals with sesame allergy to present when dining out as well. And again, as we continue to work to find ways to support folks who are dealing with sesame, but we are hard at work on the policy front to do what we can to continue to support FDA in hopefully making the right decision and adding sesame to FALCPA. That's in a nutshell from my perspective. I know we have time for questions here.
Yes. So during the presentation today, we've been sort of collecting questions, and I'm going to try to get to as many of them as I can. One quick little precursor is that some of the questions that have come through are a little bit specific to individual treatment and care plans, and we would certainly advise connecting with your allergist or your care providers to kind of address questions about testing results or interpreting testing, or you know, determining if additional testing is necessary. But we will try to respond to as many of these as we can. The one question that had come through was related to the and I think this is probably more for you, Dr. Wood, related to sort of the timing of some of the studies, given that the last kind of U.S. study that's referenced was from 2008, they had inquired as to if any more current studies may be on the horizon, or if you happen to know anything from a research end as far as studies.
Yeah, so that's a very relevant question, as you know, we do believe that many of these food allergies are still on the rise, and the rise has been rapid enough that a 5 to 10 year window might lead to some very different results. So there are a number of studies going on around the world, including the United States, addressing these prevalence issues. they're not going to be directly comparable, because unless you use the same methods of diagnosis and food challenge and things, it's going to be hard to say we have a definite change, but you're very appropriate in pointing out that this prevalence is a moving target, and additional studies need to be done, and the more ammunition we have to deal with this from a policy standpoint, the better off we would be. So that's a point well taken, and I think that we would expect to be seeing some new data over the next few years.
Great, thank you. Another question that had kind of come through was from a parent whose child had outgrown a sesame allergy, and as a teenager, the number then started climbing. I guess that she had previously reacted to sesame, was tested, and was diagnosed, and then the allergy had gone away and returned. And so this is probably more of a general question, related to returning of food allergies after, it seems that they've outgrown. But do you see any greater sort of prevalence with sesame, or just as a commonality with specific allergens?
Yeah, so it's an important point, and when we see someone who, say, comes through and passes a sesame challenge, we would ask whether they fit into a category of somebody who was probably never allergic. They had a positive test, but were probably never allergic. And in that case, it probably doesn't matter what they do, whether they eat it regularly or not, versus somebody who was almost certainly or was certainly allergic in the past, and where we found in our studies, particularly a peanut allergy, that having regular exposure does help prevent recurrence of the allergy, or looked at the other way, not having a regular exposure puts you at some risk of getting the allergy back. Sesame would be kind of like peanut in this context. When it first happened with peanut, we were actually a little bit surprised, because we were most used, this was back about 15, 18 years ago, we were most used to having children outgrow milk and egg allergy, and we almost never saw it return. And what we realized when we really sat down and thought about it was it didn't return with milk and egg, because they incorporated it in their diet on a regular enough basis to prevent the recurrence of the allergy. And when we looked at peanuts, 75% of people who outgrow peanut allergy continued to avoid peanuts, so they were really not being exposed unless they intentionally did it. And I would say sesame is going to act more like peanut this way. Unless you go out of your way to find it and keep it in your diet, you may fail to have enough exposure to prevent a recurrence. So we tell everyone who we think was sesame allergic in the past, who appears to have outgrown their allergy, to keep it in their diet, ideally several times per week, indefinitely. Great,
thank you. Scott, this may be more of a question for you. Somebody had inquired as to what they can do to help with some of the FDA labeling laws in terms of labeling for sesame.
So I think a couple of things, just as a general, if you're interested in being involved in our advocacy efforts, I would strongly encourage you to visit our website and sign up as an advocate. Secondarily, I would suggest, I would say feel free to email me, and I'll get you connected as well with our efforts. I think, it's helpful for us to know, where folks are. It's never hurtful to know, if there are folks in particular, if we're working to build champions, for instance, on the Hill, knowing what who your senator is, for instance, and what we might be able to do in terms of bringing to bear another powerful story to bring some data to light. So I would say sign up for our advocacy network, and also share your story with us, and we'll work to get you involved as the appropriate sort of vehicles are available to us. It's always a challenge, and there's sort of to be at the right time and the right place, and so we're working to create those avenues where all of your voices can be most well heard and appreciated.
Great. Sort of a tag along to that question. In the meantime, while we're working to overcome some of these labeling concerns, both of you may have some insights on this, on how to deal with companies who won't disclose if it's a spice or a natural flavor when a company says that it's proprietary and non-disclosable.
Well, I think from the medical standpoint, that's a typical frustration, and I don't know of any solution to make that company behave differently. And it really is mostly a matter then for you and your allergist to decide how worried we really are about that kind of exposure being a risk. And I don't think we can take it beyond that. It's really an individual consideration. And I think that with Sesame, you know, as I mentioned, there are some patients where any exposure would be a huge risk, and others where a trivial exposure would really not be a risk. So that I think needs to be more handled from a medical standpoint on a individual patient basis with you and your allergist.
And I would just add, from the policy perspective, you know, if you're running into those challenges, it's important to document the particular sort of story and challenge. You know, there is a mechanism by which you can share that information with FDA, and I would ask you to share it with us as well. It does, you know, as Dr. Wood mentioned earlier, because of the challenge, particularly with sesame and mustard and a few other allergens, you know, sort of being, you know, hidden, so to speak, in natural flavorings or other areas. You know, from a policy perspective, it's helpful when we can kind of bring those situations to light with FDA, because you know, that's a more specific to sesame and mustard and some of the other seeds and whatnot than it is to things that are more obvious and are not used in that way. So I would say document the story, make sure that you have shared that story with FDA through their, you know, it's often an adverse event reporting structure for consumers, and share it with us as well, because it is important to be able to document the challenges that consumers are having, even being able to get to the information when they ask for it specifically.
And one other thing that I would just add on that is, as you're kind of reaching out to companies, if you're looking to sort of find out if sesame is included as part of a spice mix or anything like that, making sure that you're upfront and disclosing that you have a specific allergy, and you want to know about a specific ingredient because of that food allergy, as opposed to just sort of a general ask of what is contained in the product. You may be a little bit more successful in getting the information you're seeking. Dr. Wood, this was a question for you from one of our teen parents. Their teen is in the 1% reaction history with severe anaphylaxis to sesame and wants to know what advice for dating and kissing you may have. They have advised that the risk is similar to peanut and same recommended precautions should be considered. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. You know, it's possible that different forms of sesame may, you know, have more residual allergen in and around the mouth than others. So you'd envision that, you know, most sesame seeds would pass down fairly quickly, whereas hummus might hang around more like peanut butter would. But the general precaution would be the same as we would make for people with other food allergies, that kissing is a risk, can be associated with full-blown reactions, and it's something that needs to be communicated between that patient and their date or anyone they may be in close contact with in terms of when they might have eaten that food and what they've done to clean their mouth and lips off afterwards. Great,
thank you. One of the other questions that came through from sort of a testing standpoint is, when doing skin testing, is general practice sort of to use the whole seed or more of the pulverized form of the allergen?
So skin testing is most often done, you know, with a commercially available extract, where in extract in the seeds, it's been pulverized. There are some people who like to use fresh foods for testing. We don't find at our clinic that it adds very much. If we were going to do it, though, we would certainly want to have the seeds broken down. It wouldn't be that practical to be trying to skin test with an intact kind of seed. But we think the commercially available extracts that are typically used do a good job in picking out the people who are truly sensitive to sesame.
Great. And to that end, is there any data that exists about a connection between patients who have an anaphylactic reaction to, like, tahini hummus and being highly allergic to a whole seed?
Well, it's again very individual, but there are large numbers of patients. In my clinical practice, I would say more than 50% of those that have significant reactions to tahini are minimally or non-reactive to a couple of seeds. That can only be, you know, really sorted out by a careful evaluation that may require a food challenge.
Great. Scott, I think this is probably a question for you. Somebody had inquired of if there's anything they can do to support the IOM efforts.
I think at this moment, I would say the answer is no. Stay tuned. You know, the Institute of Medicine studies, consensus studies, you know, one of the keys, you know, to sort of build the case to get them started, and then obviously to find the sponsorships, which they have done. So they've gotten the study started. There were two basically public opportunities, workshops that came over the last couple of months, one the kickoff meeting and then a public workshop about a month or so ago. I don't anticipate at this moment that they'll have additional public workshops for story sharing, but it is possible, and you can sign up on their website for information about that particular project should they have updates to the public on that front. And again, we would just say stay connected with FAIR, because obviously our ability to gather support from the public has made us, you know, able to get that study started. So please stay connected with us.
Great, thank you. Another question that has come through is related to sort of preparation of sesame, which I think is a helpful point of clarification with any allergen, which the question is, does cooking or heating sesame neutralize the allergen?
It does not appear to. So if it does, it's in a very minimal kind of way. So I think the safe answer is no. Do not assume that because it's in a baked product it would be any less potent.
Great. Thank you. We are just about at time for the day, so I wanted to take the opportunity to share a little bit about our next month's webinar. I also really want to thank Dr. Wood and Scott for their help today. If you have additional questions that you'd like to send to us after this webinar is complete, you can email us. The email address that you can reach our education team is education@foodallergy.org. We can try to get some additional insights from Scott and Dr. Wood. I know that somebody had expressed info and wanting to do some story sharing as well. So go ahead and send that over to education@foodallergy.org, and we will be able to follow up with that. So I wanted to just quickly mention that our next month's webinar is going to be led by Kyle Dine. And I also, sorry, quickly before I do that, I want to just also mention that after this webinar, you're going to receive a little link in your post-webinar email from FAIR. It's a short survey link that's included for you to share feedback on today's presentation and to provide comments on webinar topics that you'd like to see in the future. So if you could, please take a minute to complete this and help FAIR's education team continue to deliver meaningful information to you. Next month, we're going to be joined by trusted food allergy educator and musician Kyle Dine, who he's going to be highlighting specific risks related to teens and discuss ways for teens and young adults to become empowered in managing their food allergies. Kyle speaks from the perspective of someone who's grown up with food allergies and has learned many lessons along the way. He stresses the importance of staying positive, keeping things in perspective while staying safe with allergies, and he's going to share some stories that teens can relate to and provide sound advice that will help teens prepare for risks while balancing a normal teenage life. The webinar will be on Wednesday, November 18th at 2015. Our webinar time, because of the fact that it is targeted towards teens, and we want to be mindful that some teens will be in school during our regular webinar time and try to reach as many of them as we can, although the webinar, once again, will be recorded. We'll be doing it a little bit later than usual, so we'll be doing it from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Member registration is going to open this Friday, October 16th, and we will open general registration on Monday, October 19th. So once again, sorry.
I just want to add one note, and I appreciate that we have some terrific webinars coming up. We've had some terrific ones. We make all of these available for free to the public. So I would just say, you know, when I mentioned staying connected with us, it's incredibly important. It's your support, your giving, your signing up for a walk, raising funds, taking the Teal Pumpkin Pledge. Anything you can do to support FAIR makes all of these webinars, makes the Institute of Medicine study. All of those things are possible through your support for FAIR. So please consider that if you are enjoying these and making the most of this and you have the opportunity to support us. Please do.
Thank you, Scott. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Wood and Scott for both spending their time with us today. Dr. Wood, for sharing your expert insights and research findings on this topic that is really of increasing importance to our community. And so many people have expressed appreciation already that it's an undercovered topic, and we're really grateful to have you sharing your insights on that, and to Scott as well for sharing what we can do as we kind of move forward. So that will conclude today's webinar. I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us, and we hope to see you again next month.